Now, for our crossover to Germany this week, we discuss tourism as Ghana looks at boosting the sector with a cash injection. Europe is reactivating tourism. Germany has now had 2 long weekends to test internal travel. France has also begun allowing people to travel throughout the country, and Spain is discussing traveling between regions. Political correspondent with our partners Thomas Sparrow has been analyzing the situation with Gifty Ando Apia.
The latest announcement, Gifty, from the German government came today on Wednesday when it announced that it would be lifting its travel warning for the EU and other countries in Europe as of June 15th. And it will be changing that travel warning for travel advice for the specific countries. It's important to differentiate between a travel warning, which essentially tells people not to travel to a specific place, and a travel advice, which gives people the decision to make or not make that specific travel plan based on what the government considers appropriate. So it's a very different measure, a very different way of handling it if you consider travel warnings and travel advice. And the German government again has announced that it will be changing that. What this essentially means in practical terms is that the tourist sector can continue to reopen, and people will be allowed and will be able to plan their summer holidays in the European Union countries. Whether they do that, it's another matter, because we've already heard in different parts of Europe that even if people are allowed to do so, not many tourists are actually planning to travel to those countries given the current public health situation. So this is the latest from Germany, and it is not only here in Germany, in other parts of Europe this is also being discussed and changed. And for example, Italy, well, you know that Italy was the first big European country to be particularly hit by the coronavirus. Italy, as of today, will allow again travelers from the European Union, and it lifted as well a ban on traveling between its different regions. So you can see step by step, in a phased way, European Union countries are taking measures to reopen the tourist sector, which is particularly important for the continent as a whole.
Thomas, I'd like to understand the trends. Which country is opening up to which one? And do we know why? Any special reasons?
Well, obviously there are different things to consider here, Gifty. One thing that has to be considered is the situation in each specific country when it comes to public health, because when you look at how the coronavirus affected the European Union, it did not affect every country in the same way. So countries like Spain or Italy or France or the United Kingdom were particularly affected by this in Europe, whereas others were not so badly affected. So when you look at that, many countries that have similar trends or have similar coronavirus situations have obviously tried to open up their common borders if they have some. But there has also been a warning that by doing so, you're essentially creating bubbles, if you will, where tourism can reopen, and bubbles where tourism does not reopen. So that's why the European Union also tried to lay out plans for this to happen in a more or less coordinated way, even though it's particularly difficult. If you look, for example, at Germany and its border countries, Germany will, or at least plans to reopen its borders to most of its countries in the next few weeks. That includes Austria, for example, that includes Denmark, that includes other countries as well. And in some countries there are particular reasons and particular conditions as well. So something very important to understand in all of this, Gifty, is that we're not talking about a return to normal as you experienced many summers ago. There is a sort of new sense of normality, which means that people will have to accustom themselves to this new reality and also take precautions accordingly.
Whilst authorities decide to open up, as gradual as it may be, what is the update on the infection trends at the moment? Because that's an important part in making this decision.
It is not only one important aspect, it is the important aspect. And in fact, the German government, the German foreign minister, has said that Germany will continue to monitor how the situation develops, not only here in this country, but in other parts of the continent as well. And if numbers go up, above a specific threshold. If numbers go up in specific regions, then the German government, and by the way other governments as well, can reissue some of those warnings, alerting people not to travel to a specific place if there is, for example, a second wave. However, if we look at current numbers here in the continent, you do see that in many countries those numbers have been dropping to a point that the countries can start, or at least continue, to reopen in many different aspects, and that one of those aspects is obviously tourism. If you look at tourism accounts for about 10% of economic output in Europe, and there are millions of jobs in Europe that depend on the tourist sector. And it is also important to stress that many countries that were particularly affected by the coronavirus pandemic are also particularly dependent on tourism. If you think, for example, of Spain, France, or Italy. So these countries were obviously very interested in trying to reopen their tourist sector as soon as possible, obviously maintaining precautions and limitations to try and make sure that the economic difficulties that come attached to all this crisis are reduced a little bit by the possibility of reintroducing tourism in different sectors that in many cases are dependent on them to a large extent.
Finally, Thomas, how are people responding or reacting to these new directives, if you like, in announcement?
For many Europeans, being able to travel in the summer is particularly important, not only because it's a tradition here, it's something that families tend to plan well in advance, but also for kids who are on summer holidays and who would be at home. Many kids, or at least most kids, have been at home for the past few months as well. So many Europeans do feel that being able to travel, even if it's within their own country, even if it's maybe in a different region, is something that will be very welcome. At the same time, as I said in my first answer, there is concern about how much Europeans will actually travel, because there are already hotels, for example, in various countries that have said that they're not going to open, even if they can, if at the same time people are not making any bookings or not traveling to those destinations. So it is something that is very, very sort of small, as I said, a phased start to tourism in the European Union, and what that has, on the one hand, many people obviously very happy about the prospects of being able to travel again. On the other hand, people conscious that the situation is still very difficult, that the coronavirus has not gone away, even if numbers are down, and that as such they will have to take specific precautions. And an additional element that I would like to add is that obviously for many families the coronavirus crisis has come hand in hand with economic difficulties. So it is still very much open, very much in the air to what extent people will still have the capacity to travel abroad or even within their own countries after all these problems attached to the coronavirus crisis.